Hello and welcome, I'm your Code Monkey. So, do you know if color can ever be null? Do you know what is the purpose of a namespace? Do you always have to extend MonoBehavior? Or do you know what will happen on January 19, 2038? So, can you answer these questions? Whether you answer yes or no, either way, hopefully you will learn something. A while ago, I built a system that I've wanted to build for a real long time. I manually wrote a ton of interesting questions and then wrote some super detailed answers. Then I made a system that automatically every 3 days picks a brand new question. You can find the latest question directly on the website. Or you can just go to your user page and enable question of the day emails. That way when a question is generated, you automatically get an email. I think this is a pretty fun way to learn, and personally I've already enjoyed using this system. Since I wrote so many questions, there's a bunch of them that when they spawn, I don't even remember writing them. In this video, let's go through the last 10 questions, try to answer them, and go through all of the very detailed answers to see if we can learn something. And if you haven't seen the Humble Bundle with tons of tools, then definitely check it out. For just $35, you can get tons of tools that do all kinds of things. You've got some visuals, some things for animating, some things for 2D soft body, cars, handling feedback forms, slicing things, and even completing templates. Or if all you want are just some visuals, then the Cindy store has just started their holiday season sale. All with tons of assets in their gorgeous style. They even have a fun holiday gift basket. Or alternatively, the Unity Asset Store is also having their New Year sale. I haven't yet had the time to look at this one, but I'm sure tons of awesome stuff are currently on sale. So if you need anything, check out all the links in the description. So starting off with question number 1, what is the significance of January 1st, 1970? So is that the Skyrim release date on the Magnavox Odyssey, or is it the start of Unix time? If you want, pause the video and choose your answer. For this one, January 1st, 1970, I'm pretty sure is the start of Unix time. And yep, that is indeed correct. Unix timestamps are something that is extremely useful. If you've ever had to deal with time zones and converting things back and forth, then you know that it is a complete nightmare to work with all kinds of time zones. There's a really hilarious video from 9 years ago where Tom Scott goes insane trying to deal with time zones. So in order to avoid you going insane by the exact same reason, said Unix timestamps are much easier to deal with. This basically contains the number of seconds elapsed since January 1st, 1970. So for example, if your game deals with real-world time in any way, like for example storing when the user completes some kind of achievement or when the user created some kind of mod, for that you can store the time as a Unix timestamp and then you can easily convert it into whatever time zone you want. And in C#, it's super easy to get it, just use datetimeoffset.now.2 Unix time seconds. And then as some examples, here are some videos that I made, like the one for the free online leaderboard. You'd probably include a timestamp for when the user achieved that score. That way you could filter out old scores. Then like I said, for modding, in order to save the data for when that mod was created, you could include that directly in the mod file. Or for making all kinds of unique mechanics, storing the time is usually something you can do, and again, using a timestamp is super easy. So basically, whenever you need to handle time in any way, a simple unique timestamp will work wonders. So question number 2, can you modify the transform.for directly in order to rotate a transform? So yes or no? In my case, I do know the answer is yes, because this is indeed my favorite rotation method. If you read it, then it's going to return the forward vector for the object that you have selected, but you can also set it in order to rotate it. So for me, the simplest way to make it look at something is just calculate a simple direction towards that target and set the transform forward to that target. Personally, I still have trouble understanding how quaternions work, and Euler angles are sometimes a bit tricky. So for me, whenever I want to rotate something, usually transform.forward, that's the method that I most prefer. And again, you can modify transform forward, but also all the other ones, like transform.right or transform.up. For example, this one can be super useful when dealing with collisions and normals. This is exactly what I did in this video on the Scout Probe launcher from Outer Wilds. In there, I made it that whenever the probe was thrown, whenever it landed on something, it automatically used the collider normal in order to point in the opposite direction. So that way it perfectly fits, perfectly matches whatever terrain, whatever surface it lands on. And like I said, you can also modify transform.right. So when working in 2D, usually that's the best one because usually pointing to the right, that is going to be default for any sprite you draw. On to the next question. Let's say I saved my game data in a text file and I am now trying to load it. So does this work? So I've got a string, saved health data, and I've got the string 100. And then I've got an int health amount and I'm simply setting it to the saved health data. So does this work? Yes, no, or yes, but health amount will be 0. This one is a fun question to teach you the basics about how types are different. In this case, you cannot directly convert a string onto an int, so I do know the answer is no. And yet that is exactly the answer, is because you cannot implicitly convert a string onto an int. In order to do that, convert a string onto a value, you can use int.parse or int.tryparse, or for float, you got float.parse and so on. So for example, in this case, you would take the save health data and call int.parse, and that does return an int if it can indeed parse that text. Or alternatively, you can use something like JSON. This is a widely used data format. It is all string-based and it automatically handles the conversions. For me, I use JSON a lot whenever I want to save anything. It's the simplest way to save pretty much any data. It's how I normally handle saving and loading, and I very much rarely have to manually parse some numbers. I got a video on JSON, one on saving and loading. This video is pretty old, but it's still exactly up to date. It is still exactly the same system that I use for saving and loading nowadays. Even in my latest game, Dinky Gardens, it uses pretty much exactly the same thing that I covered in this video. And how to save multiple things, save a file, the save file alongside a screenshot or really any data you want. This is also really interesting. And then also, somewhat related, do you know you can also implement implicit type conversions to your own custom types? You can just define a implicit operator, and that way you can convert your custom type, like for example something called health amount, you can automatically convert that into an int. If you do a lot of things with custom types that have some kind of mathematical conversion, or really just conversion into any other type, then looking into this implicit operator, that can be super useful, save you a ton of time. Next question, what is the color on the sprite renderer after running this code? So first we've got a variable, color myColor, and it's set to color.red. Then we assign the sprite render.color to myColor, and then we modify myColor to color.blue. So by the end, after running these 3 lines of code, is the color on the sprite render, is that going to be red, blue, or don't you know? And I know this is a fun question to talk about the differences between reference and value types. So in this case, I do know the color is going to be red. And yep, there it is, that's correct. And the trick here is that color is a struct, which is a value type and not a reference type. So when you assign a color, or really any struct, any value type, when you assign that onto a sprite renderer, you pass in a copy at that time. So when you later on modify it, it does not modify the copy that the sprite renderer holds. It just creates a brand new copy. This is something that you absolutely must know, the differences between value types and reference types. If you don't know that difference, then at some point you're going to go crazy when you try to modify something and you don't understand that you are modifying a copy, not the actual object. I've got a very useful video on that topic. If instead of being a struct, if this one was a class, then when you assign it, you would assign a reference, and if you modify the original data, so if you modified some parameter inside the myColor, if you did that, then you would be modifying the actual underlying object, which again, the sprite renderer would also be pointing to the same object, so that one would also update. But in this case, since color is a struct, then modifying that is really just modifying a copy, so it does not affect the original sprite render. Okay, question number 5. What is the purpose of a namespace? So is it to confuse you? Maybe. Is it to get better performance, or is it to keep your code organized? And for this one, let's say the goal is to confuse you. And nope, obviously that is not correct. The answer is obviously to keep your code organized. So it does not give you better performance. Setting a namespace does absolutely nothing when it comes to performance. Namespaces are used to help you keep your code more organized with various systems cleanly separated. So for example, a direct example directly from Unity, all of the UI code, all of that exists inside the namespace unityengine.ui. Now for example, all the file handling is inside system.io, all of the entity stuff is inside unity.entities and so on. So as your project grows, code organization becomes more and more important, so you can definitely use namespace to keep your code base nice and under control. You can define a namespace, and then inside you can define any class and anything like that. Then you just need to add using your namespace, and then you can access the type directly inside that namespace. And this is also one very useful way to avoid name collisions. One common collision that I encounter pretty much all the time is this one. There's a random class both inside Unity Engine and one inside System. So if you write this code, it's actually going to throw an error because it does not know which random you are trying to use. Normally, I always want to use the random from the Unity Engine, so really you can just write the full name. Personally, I prefer this one as opposed to the one in System. That one requires creating, requires setting up a seed and so on, whereas this one is much more similar to use. So yep, when you have conflicts between various class types, then using the full name, that is one great way to solve it. However, like I say here, every tool can be either used or abused. If you make a different namespace for literally every single class, then you're probably doing way too much. At that point, it's probably hurting you more than it helps. But when used correctly, namespaces can indeed help you keep your codebase much more organized. And then yet another benefit, and this one that does speed up code compilation, it's not the namespace by default that do that. Instead, it is something called assembly definitions that Unity has, where it can basically create an assembly definition for an entire namespace. That lets you split your codebase into multiple assemblies, and whenever you modify some code, it will only recompile the code on the assemblies that need recompilation. So for super huge games, this is super useful. For example, if you're only working on your UI code, you put a proper namespace for your UI code and then different namespaces with different definitions for things like your gameplay code, your gameplay logic, your AI, and so on. And then when you modify the UI, it only recompiles the UI code, does not recompile everything else. And that makes the code base, the code compilation, makes it much, much faster. If you want to know about assembly definitions, I have a lecture on it in my Ultimate Unity Overview course. Then here's a fun question. Where is the modulo operator particularly useful? So is it for looping back on a list? Is it for counting elements in a list? Or is it for creating a new list with a particular size? This is one of the most useful things. Personally, I don't know much about math, but I do know about this because it is extremely useful. And the main way that I find particularly useful is for looping back directly on a list. So yep, that is the correct answer. And yep, this is exactly what I do so many times. It's very useful when you want to loop back to the beginning after reaching the end. So in this case, you take the index, you increment by 1, then you use the modulo, which is only the remainder of the division. You do the modulo with the count for the entire list, and that basically means that as the value over here matches the value in here, basically it's going to loop back into 0. Like I said, I don't know much about math, but I do know that the modulo operation, that one returns the remainder of the division. So as you increase your index, it will automatically loop back to 0. This is super great for things like pooling systems. You can constantly loop back and reuse all the items. But it's also not just for lists. This is really just a mathematical operation. So another place where I use this quite a lot is in making day-night cycles. So you can take your daytime, you can increase by delta time, and then get the remainder for some kind of daytime max. So as the day constantly increases, at some point it loops back to 0 and then continues. So this is pretty much the basic logic for how I handle day-night cycle in pretty much all my games. And Unity also did something similar in their Happy Harvest 2D sample. This is a really awesome sample. If you don't know about all the tons of 2D tools, definitely go watch this if you want. Next question, when you create a new script, do you always have to extend MonoBehavior? So yes, no, or only if you want to use it as a game object component. And for this question, I'm going to answer only if you want to use it as a component. Although technically the answer no, that one is technically also true, since you don't always have to extend it, only if you want to use it as a game object component. So MonoBehavior is basically the base class that you need to extend if you want to attach it to a game object. It is also what automatically handles functions like start and update to have those automatically called by Unity. However, it is not necessary. You can definitely use just basic C# classes, that works just fine. For example, in my case, in the various videos that I have on the grid system is just a regular C# class. It is used by the constructor, it is not attached to any game object. There are many times in games where you don't really need to use something as a component. You really just need some kind of container for logic to do all kinds of things. And if it doesn't need to be attached to a game object, then maybe you don't need MonoBehavior. For example, in my game Dinky Guardians, I've got the off-world logic. That is basically the logic for when the Dinkies and all the objects in that world, when those are on a different world from the one where the player is on right now, since that simulation continues happening all the time. And for those are really just regular C# objects. Those do not implement MonoBehavior, although they do have an update method. But instead of having that update method being called by Unity directly, instead I've got a Dinky off-world manager that one cycles through all of those C# objects and manually calls the update function. That way I have a bit more control over how often I want to call that update. In my case, in order to make the off-world objects, in order to make that quite a bit more performant, I made it so it only updates 10 times per second instead of something like 60 FPS. And just a nice tip, making normal C# classes, that one allows you to use their constructor, which you cannot do if you do extend MonoBehavior. Okay, question number 8. What is the main difference between the out and the ref keywords? Meaning, what is the behavior inside the function? So is it that out does not need to be set, whereas ref must be set? Or is it out must be set and ref does not need to be set? Or is there no difference? These are two super useful keywords. It allows you to have quite a bit more control over the code that you write. This is actually something that used to trip me up for quite a while, but at some point I got it locked in my brain. And now I do know that the out must be set and ref does not need to be set. And yep, that is correct. And yeah, this one is a tricky one since only 60% of people got it right. Basically, the ref keyword, this one passes a parameter as a reference, meaning it basically passes in a pointer to the original position in memory. So if you change that variable directly inside the function, it will also change outside, since both will be pointing to the exact same object. However, you are not forced to change it. You can receive a ref parameter and never touch it at all. Whereas the out keyword, that one tells the compiler this parameter will be set before leaving this function. Out basically means output, so if you call some function and pass in some output, you do expect some output to come out of it. I've got a super tiny quick tip video on this topic. So as an example, when using ref, you can basically define your function, then you just need to have the ref keyword, and basically this parameter will be used as a reference. Then if you modify this parameter inside of it, it will also modify it outside of it. Again, a while ago, we were talking about the differences between value types and reference types. And here we can see a direct example about it. So int, this one is a value type, meaning normally when you pass in an int to a function, it will actually pass in a copy and not a reference to the original object. But over here, since we are using the ref keyword, instead of passing in as a copy, now we are passing in a reference, even though int is a value type. So by doing this, even though we are using an int, since we pass in as ref, we still modify the original value. However, like the question asks, you do not have to modify it. So you can't just receive a ref and then not touch it at all. This is perfectly valid code. It's wasteful since you're not going to do anything, but it is perfectly valid. Whereas the example with the out keyword, here's one example. Try to get the player name. This is usually when you want to use something like the out keyword. Usually I like to make functions that try to do something, then they return a boolean whether they succeed or not, and optionally have an out parameter if it does succeed at doing something. So in this case, it checks if it has a player. If not, then it basically sets the player name to empty and simply returns false because it could not get the player name. If not, if the player does exist, then get the player name and return true. So then to use it, you can just have a boolean because this one is going to return true or false if it does have a name or not. And then you can check if it does have a name, then do a log on the player name. This is pretty much exactly how Unity's try-get component works. It does pretty much exactly the same thing. It returns a boolean and has an out parameter. However, like it says here, unlike ref, when you use out, you must assign the parameter. So if you do this, if you have an out parameter and you start and you end the function without ever assigning it, if so, this is going to throw a compile error. If you define an out parameter, you must set it before you exit that function. So these two parameters, out and ref, these are great ways to return multiple pieces of data from one function. Since normally you can only have a single return type, you can only have a single type over here. Technically, of course, you can make a custom class, a custom type to hold whatever data you want, but you can only have a single type here, whereas you can have multiple out parameters to return multiple pieces of data. And just related to it is the in keyword. This one forces a parameter to only be used as input. This is actually a keyword that you have to use if you're working with dots. In order to handle all of the read-write logic, dots requires you to use the in keyword to define read-only components. And alternatively, if you're using C#7, you can also use something called tuples. So you can basically define a type that inside holds multiple types, and then you can access those types with item 1, item 2, and so on. Or alternatively, you can give them proper names along with their proper types, and you can indeed make functions that return that tuple with all of those pieces of data. So as you can see, C# has tons of ways to get tons of data from any function you want. Then the next question, can color ever be null? So is it yes always, is it no, or yes as nullable? And now this is one that sort of ended up as a trick question, even though that wasn't my goal. So can color ever be null? And the answer is no, because it can never be null. But the answer is also yes, because you can make it null if you make it a nullable. So technically both these are also correct. Basically, color is a struct, and structs can never be null. Again, definitely make sure you know the differences between those two. So color cannot be null, just like ints cannot be null, bools cannot be null, and so on. However, you can make any of those into null if you use a nullable variable. So in C#, you just add a question mark directly after the type, and that makes it a nullable. With this, you can make anything into null. For example, a vector3, you can make that into a null. You can have a vector3 nullable for the target position, and then you can check if this one is null, then I assume that means no target position, and if it does have value, then that is the target position. For example, on the video where I made the third-person shooter controller, for that one, it does a raycast in order to find the mouse position in the world. However, of course, the raycast has to hit something. If there's no collider, then the raycast is never going to hit anything. So in this demo, the simple thing that I did was just made some invisible walls directly all over the world. That way the raycast always hits something. But alternatively, I could have also done this. I could have tried doing the raycast, and then if it doesn't hit anything, then I would just set the target position to null. And then I would have the shooter logic. That one test, okay, does target position have value? If so, shoot towards that position. If not, then there's no value. And final question, what will happen on January 19, 2038, exactly at 3 AM, 14 minutes and 7 seconds? So is it going to be the Armageddon? I hope not, since at that time I will only be around 40. Is it going to be the end of Unix time, or is it finally going to be the Half-Life 3 release date? Now, even if you don't know just by looking at these questions, you can probably guess the answer is, yep, it is the end of Unix time. And for this one, hopefully nothing will happen, but basically this is the point where the 32-bit number used for Unix timestamps, when that one pretty much rolls over. Like I mentioned in the previous question, timestamps are insanely useful. They're a super simple way to store time, but of course, since it's an int that is constantly counting up since January 1970, if you use a 32-bit int number, then at some point that is actually going to roll over. And the maximum number that you can have is this value right here, which if we convert that into a date, it is going to turn into this date in January 19, 2038. So this is pretty much exactly the same thing that happened on Y2K, which actually at this point makes me question how many of you are young enough to not know what Y2K is. Basically that was the year 2000, and there was a whole problem that could have happened because a lot of computer systems pretty much just stored the last 2 digits of the year, which of course that works if you're in like 1970, 1971, 72, 73, and so on. But as soon as you get to 1995, 96, 97, 98, 99, and then goes back into 0, if you don't handle that, then all computers could go pretty crazy by suddenly thinking that we are now 100 years in the past. So a lot of people had to work really tirelessly to update all of those systems to make sure that they could handle difference going from 99 to 00. In most cases, I assume they just made 4 digits for the year. So 1999 going into 2000, that wouldn't cause any issues. And anyway, so over here it's going to cause the exact same thing. If no one handles it, then it's suddenly going to turn into a massive negative number. But a super simple fix is just, instead of storing those Unix timestamps in a 32-bit int, it can either be an unsigned 32-bit number or a simple 64-bit number. So for example, in C#, that would be the type long. And for this, I actually experienced this bug myself. In my game, GameCorp, in the original Flash version, I was storing the money, including cents, in a simple int. So for example, if something was $1, it was storing the value 100. And eventually some people played the game long enough and found success inside the game, enough to surpass $2.4 million, and all of a sudden that flipped and they ended up with negative 2.14 million. So this is definitely something that I did not consider when I made that game, and I definitely learned my lesson. Always be aware of the limits of whatever type you choose. Make sure that during gameplay it never goes past those limits, and if so, use a different type. Alright, so those are a bunch of questions. I hope you found them interesting. I hope you learned something with this. Like I said, you can always find the latest question directly on the website, or simply go to your user page and enable the question of the day, and you will automatically receive an email whenever a new question is generated. That happens every 3 days, so it's always a fun way to learn something new. Alright, so thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.